In September of 1941, a cablegram reached Canberra marked most immediate, most strictly secret and personal. It came from the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom to the Prime Minister of Australia, and it asked for something that had not been asked of an ally in that war. It asked a man to think about how history would judge him. If Australia insisted on withdrawing its soldiers from the Libyan port of Tobruk, Winston Churchill wrote, the orders would be issued accordingly, irrespective of the cost entailed and the injury to future prospects. But he trusted the Australian Prime Minister would weigh very carefully the immense responsibility he would assume before history by depriving Australia of the glory of holding Tobruk until victory was won, glory which otherwise, by God's help, would be theirs forever. Inside that port sat more than 14,000 Australians, surrounded since April, losing on average about a stone a man. The man who received the cable had been Prime Minister for 17 days and held office only by the votes of 2 independents. Tell me in the comments, when your closest ally refuses to release your own soldiers, is that loyalty or is that command? Now let's go. The second year of the war opened with the largest British victory it had yet produced. In January of 1941, the Australian 6th Division led an advance eastwards into Libya, taking the Italian fortress at Bardia and then the port of Tobruk itself, covering more than 500 kilometres and sweeping up tens of thousands of Italian prisoners. And by the middle of February, the remaining Italian forces in eastern Libya had been destroyed. In Berlin, the result produced the opposite reaction. Hitler, unwilling to watch his Italian ally collapse in North Africa altogether, ordered a German force to Tripoli under a lieutenant general named Erwin Rommel, and the first of those troops came ashore in the middle of February. Rommel was a career officer, brave and inspiring, a risk-taker who often ignored his orders, who preferred to be near the fighting and to decide from what he could see with his own eyes, and who was frequently at loggerheads with his superiors and openly contemptuous of the Italians he had been sent to rescue. His reputation as the Desert Fox was built by Axis and Allied officers, by war correspondents, and by propagandists on both sides, and also, in no small measure, by the man himself. What happened next was not a defeat so much as a substitution. The victorious 6th Division was relieved in March and sent to Greece, and the formation that took its place in Cyrenaica was the 9th Australian Division, newly raised, untested, and dispatched to the desert untrained, and without its own artillery. Greece had been stripped from the desert to garrison a campaign that would itself end in evacuation, and the 9th Division was not a formation being pushed forward into an opportunity. It was a formation filling a hole left by one that had been taken away. Rommel understood the British were overstretched and attacked in the last days of March. The retreat that followed was chaotic enough that the Australians gave it a name borrowed from a racecourse, calling the scramble east the Benghazi Handicap. And during the confusion, the 2 most senior British generals in Libya were both captured. On the 10th of April, the last Australians came inside the perimeter at Tobruk, and the first shots were exchanged along the wire. By the afternoon of the 11th, which was Good Friday, the fortress was surrounded on every side but the sea. The place they were now inside had been worth holding since antiquity. Tobruk lies roughly 150 kilometres west of the Egyptian frontier and possesses the best natural harbour in North Africa. And after their invasion of Libya in 1911, the Italians had spent 3 decades turning it into a modern fortress. In the Desert War, where armies moved on petrol and drank water carried to them, ports were the whole argument. The garrison holding this one was a scratch collection assembled at speed. The 9th Australian Division formed its core, joined by the 18th Brigade of the 7th Division, which had come in by road and sea from Egypt on the 7th of April, and around them stood 4 regiments of British artillery, British machine gunners, a handful of tanks and armoured cars, and an Indian cavalry regiment that would spend the entire siege fighting as infantry. Polish and Czechoslovak troops would arrive later. 3 concentric arcs of defence enclosed the town. The outermost, called the Red Line, ran for more than 45 kilometres behind anti-tank ditches, wire and mines. 3 kilometres back lay the Blue Line, and closer to the town a third position, the Green Line. The initial defence was organised by Major General John Laverack, and within a week of the encirclement, the fortress passed to the man who would hold it for the rest of the siege, Major General Leslie James Morshead. He had been born at Ballarat East in September of 1889, the son of a gold miner who had come out from Cornwall by way of Canada. He trained as a school teacher, commanded a battalion on the Western Front in the First War, and spent the years between the wars working for a shipping company. He was slight of build, and looked exactly like the businessman he was in civilian life, which did nothing to soften what he was in uniform. His men called him Ming the Merciless, after the villain in the Flash Gordon pictures. Accounts differ on why. One version holds that he had a habit of squinting and stroking his chin while thinking, much as the character did while describing his plans. Another holds that it was simply his standards, and cites a man who once complained in writing that an awful lot of objectionable and meaningless swearing was occurring in work parties, and that this was not a good sign of discipline. That handover happened in the middle of the first serious attempt to break in. During the night of Easter Sunday, the 13th of April, German machine gunners worked their way through the Red Line near a position called Post R33. Lieutenant Austin McKell took Corporal John Edmondson, Private Ron Grant, and 4 other men out at them with bayonets. Grant wrote to his father afterwards that there seemed to be bombs going off everywhere, and that with a blood-curdling shout they tore into them. The fighting was hand to hand, and it was vicious. Edmondson, already mortally wounded, killed several Germans and saved McKell's life, and was carried back to the post, where he died in the early hours of the 14th. He was 26 years old, and he received the first Victoria Cross awarded to an Australian in the Second World War. The main German attack came before dawn, tanks and infantry pushing up from the south. Major John Balfour described it later to the war correspondent Chester Wilmot. The crossing was churned up, and the tanks threw clouds of dust as they came, and there was the smoke of 2 of them burning outside the wire, and into that dust and smoke the defenders fired anti-tank weapons, Brens, rifles and mortars, while the gunners sent over hundreds of shells. The tanks were destroyed or turned back, and the infantry following them were cut apart. Morshead's method, once the fortress was his, rested on 4 decisions, and he made all of them inside a month. The first was that there would be no withdrawal of any kind. If they had to get out, he told his men, they would fight their way out, and there was to be no surrender and no retreat. The second was that the fortress would be held in depth rather than at its edge, so that if enemy armour broke through the Red Line, the infantry in the posts were not to fall back, but to stay where they were, and kill the infantry coming along behind the tanks. The third was that the ground outside the wire belonged to the garrison. He determined, he said afterwards, that they should make no man's land their land, and put it more bluntly to his own troops, telling them they were not there to take it. They were there to give it. Patrols went out every single night. The 4th decision was that the works would never be finished, that the digging and the wiring and the mining would continue for as long as the siege did. Together, these amounted to a garrison that behaved less like a besieged force than like an army that happened to be surrounded. Rommel would test all 4 of them before the month was out. 3 weeks later, he came again, and this time he was not improvising. Between the 30th of April and the 4th of May, a deliberate, well-coordinated attack took the high ground at Ras El Madawar in the southwestern corner of the perimeter and held it. When the fighting stopped, the Germans and Italians occupied a pocket about 5.5 kilometres wide and 4 kilometres deep, and the men inside began calling it the salient. It had cost the attackers nearly 1,000 casualties and the garrison almost 800. Morshead refused to accept the loss. In June, and again in August, Australian battalions went out to take the ground back, and every attempt was beaten down with heavy losses. In places along that new line, only a few hundred metres separated the two sides, and Corporal Geoffrey Lowe of the 2nd 12th Battalion described the arithmetic of it without embellishment, saying that you could not move in daytime, you would be shot. The Easter victory had been genuine, and it was celebrated in Australia as proof that German armour could be stopped. The ground lost 3 weeks afterwards was never recovered, and it would still be in German hands on the day the Australians left. To understand what eventually got them out of that fortress, it is necessary to leave it for a moment, and to look at a document written a year earlier that nobody had yet had reason to test. The conditions under which the Australian Imperial Force served beneath the operational command of British theatre commanders were set out in an instrument known simply as Blamey's Charter. Its first operative paragraph stated that the force was to be recognised as an Australian force under its own commander, that this commander had a direct responsibility to the Commonwealth Government and the right to communicate with it directly, and that no part of the force was to be detached or employed apart from the force without his consent. Before the document was issued, the British government had been told what principles it would contain, and had accepted them. In plain terms, this meant that an Australian general sitting in Cairo could decline an order from a British commander-in-chief concerning Australian soldiers, and appeal over that commander's head to a government 12,000 miles away, and the appeal would be heard. Every Dominion contingent commander held a charter of the same kind. They were almost never invoked, in large part because British commanders knew they existed and handled Dominion formations carefully as a result. It was an instrument designed to make itself unnecessary. That instrument belonged to Lieutenant General Sir Thomas Blamey, and he is easier to admire from a distance than from close range. He had commanded the Australian Corps in Greece, and his own Chief of Staff, Brigadier Sidney Rowell, later claimed he had gone to pieces as a commander during the withdrawal through that country. Other observers who were there thought he had performed very well, and the record does not settle it. What is not disputed is that he showed real foresight in choosing the evacuation beaches before anyone had ordered a withdrawal at all, and that when the aircraft left Greece, he included his own son on the flight. Nor was he above the politics of his own army. He was reluctant to give an operational opportunity to Laverack, whom he appears to have regarded as a rival, and one historian of Australian command has observed that not for the first time petty jealousies and rivalries had a direct effect on Australian army operations. This matters because the argument he was about to start would be conducted on two grounds at once, and only one of them was medical. The other ground was the state his force was in. Returning to Egypt from Greece, Blamey cabled the Minister for the Army on the 1st of May with a plain statement of what he had found. The Australian Imperial Force was distributed among several different formations and across 10 separate areas. A substantial part of the 6th Division was in Crete. The 9th Division and one brigade of the 7th were shut inside Tobruk. Most of the rest of the 7th sat at Mersa Matruh. The 7th Divisional Cavalry Regiment was in Cyprus, a disposition made while Blamey was in Greece, without his knowledge and without anyone informing the Australian government. Canberra had already put its view on record twice, in November of 1940 and again in April of 1941. And Robert Menzies had told the Chief of the Imperial General Staff in person, in London, that it was a matter of imperative importance from Australia's point of view that all Australian forces be assembled as one corps as soon as possible. None of it had happened. The clause had sat in a filing cabinet for 18 months without being used, and the man who owned it did not yet know he was about to. Inside Tobruk, meanwhile, the siege settled into something with no visible shape and no obvious end. After the salient, the great set-piece assaults stopped, and what replaced them was a war of patrols in which the Australians went out through their own wire every night to reconnoitre, to raid, and to bring back prisoners. It kept the enemy at arm's length and stopped him observing the Australian positions, and its value was recorded most emphatically not by an Australian, but by a British gunner. Lieutenant Colonel Williams of the 1st Royal Horse Artillery wrote to the Fortress Artillery Commander asking that the enormous importance of deep patrolling by infantry be placed on record. He had served in various theatres, he said, and had never seen its value so forcibly demonstrated. The continual failure of air support, combined with the featureless nature of the desert, had made the prospect of correctly deducing enemy dispositions look hopeless, and it was only through the fearless and meticulous investigation of ground out of sight, and often deep inside the enemy's own defended localities, that a clear picture had been built up. When an air photograph of one sector finally arrived, after a wait of nearly 5 months, it was highly satisfactory to see with what astounding accuracy the patrol reports of the 2nd 13th Battalion had fixed the positions on it. That battalion is worth remembering. The conditions those patrols went out from are best described by the men who lived in them. Battalions rotated through the Red Line every few weeks, moving between concrete bunkers, sandbagged posts, caves, tunnels, and camouflage dugouts, and even out of the line the work did not stop, because there was always wire to carry, sandbags to fill, mines to lay, and water to fetch. The water was brackish, and it was always warm. Lieutenant Taz Gill of the 2nd 48th Battalion wrote home to his parents that the longing for something cool or cold was maddening. Sergeant Max Tho of the 2nd 12th remembered that they simply lived in holes in the ground, in filthy sand, with sand in their mouths, and sand in their food, and sand in their clothes. There was no escape from the artillery or the bombing, and none from the heat, the dust storms, or the insects. It was in these months that a broadcaster in Berlin gave them the only thing he ever gave them of value. William Joyce, the Englishman working for German radio, whom everyone called Lord Haw-Haw, described the garrison as living like rats in underground dugouts and caves, and the men took the name and wore it. Everything they had came in by sea, and everything that left went out the same way, which made the harbour the second front of the siege. Destroyers ran from Egypt with food, medical supplies, weapons, oil, petrol, mail, cigarettes, and reinforcements, and carried out the wounded and the prisoners, and the run became known as the Tobruk ferry service, while the approach itself became known as Bomb Alley. Between April and December, 34 ships were lost on it, and another 33 were damaged, 2 of them hospital ships. German and Italian aircraft flew 3,000 sorties against the harbour across some 750 raids. The harbour never closed. Across the whole siege, those ships delivered 72 tanks, 92 guns, close to 34,000 tons of stores, ammunition, food and fresh water, and 108 live sheep, which were rations for the Indian troops. Ashore, in the 42 days ending on the 6th of August, an average of about 650 shells a day fell on the 3 forward sectors, and the garrison's 80 guns were answering an estimated 224 Axis field guns. There was one attempt to end all of it from outside. In the middle of June, the British attacked from Egypt with the object of relieving Tobruk by land, an operation given the name Battle Axe. It opened on the 15th and was over by the 17th, having cost the attackers close to 1,000 casualties and 91 tanks. The garrison's only route out that did not involve a ship had closed in 72 hours. From that point, the siege had no foreseeable end at all, and the men holding the perimeter had been in the line continuously since March. Within a month of Battle Axe's failure, a doctor in Cairo would notice something about a handful of soldiers on leave, and the noticing would change the war for an entire division. The doctor was Major General Samuel Burston, Blamey's senior medical advisor, and what he noticed was that a few men from the Tobruk garrison he had encountered in Cairo appeared to be considerably underweight. The official history is careful about this, recording that Burston's opinion appears in the first place to have rested on that observation alone, and that subsequent investigation confirmed the impression. He put it to Blamey. When Morshead came down to Cairo between the 2nd and the 8th of July, Blamey asked him directly for his view, and Morshead told him that the garrison's capacity to resist a sustained assault was diminishing. What makes the sequence significant is what Blamey had been saying only days earlier. Asked by Menzies in the last week of June whether the Tobruk garrison could hold out, and whether the government ought to press for evacuation, Blamey had replied that he was satisfied it could hold for the present, and that there was no need to press for anything. There is no evidence he had considered requesting the relief of the 9th Division before his own medical advisor raised it with him. On the 18th of July, he wrote to General Sir Claude Auchinleck, and the letter made two arguments in a deliberate order. The first was about the men. They had been engaged continuously in operations since March and were well into their 4th month. The garrison commander had informed him that the average loss of weight was approximately 1 stone a man. A senior medical officer recently down from Tobruk reported that in the past few weeks there had been a definite decline in the health resistance of the troops, and that recovery from minor wounds and sicknesses had become markedly slower. The casualties had been considerable and could not be replaced. Within the next few months, Blamey wrote, a serious attack might be made on the garrison, and at the present rate, its capacity for resistance would by then be very greatly reduced. The second argument was the Charter. The agreed policy between the two governments was that Australian troops should operate as a single force. Australia had allowed that principle to be set aside to meet the emergencies as they arose, but it still required that the condition be observed. He could see, he concluded, no adequate reason why the conditions agreed between the two governments should not now be fulfilled. 2 days later, Menzies cabled Churchill. Now that the Syrian campaign had concluded, he wrote, Australia regarded it as of first-class importance that its troops in the Middle East be aggregated into one force. This would give them an opportunity for refreshment, for the restoration of discipline, and for refitting after a strenuous campaign. And it would also give immense satisfaction to the Australian people, for whom there was great national value and significance in knowing that all Australian soldiers in any zone formed one Australian unit. The problem, he said, had a particular bearing on the garrison at Tobruk, which had been in action without pause for 4 months, and whose fighting value must therefore be in some decline. He asked Churchill to direct the British High Command in the Middle East along those lines. What is easy to lose in everything that followed is how little was actually being asked. Nobody proposed to abandon Tobruk, or to reduce its garrison, or to alter the coalition's position in North Africa by so much as a metre of wire. The request was to change which soldiers were standing in the fortress. It involved, as Blamey had written, the movement of personnel only. The request landed on a commander who was already being squeezed from the other direction. Auchinleck had taken over the Middle East command from Wavell on the 5th of July, and almost immediately found himself under pressure from Churchill and the Chiefs of Staff to resume offensive operations at the earliest possible moment. Wavell had advised that no offensive would be practicable for 3 months, and that advice was overlooked the moment he was replaced by a commander who had struck Churchill as more forward in outlook. Auchinleck declined to be hurried. He told the Prime Minister that to launch an offensive with the inadequate means at his disposal was not a justifiable operation of war, and he refused to attack before November. Churchill was perturbed by what he called the stiffness of his attitude and concluded that the stimulation of personal contact was required to impart a less cautious mood. On the 15th of July, Auchinleck told the Chiefs of Staff he doubted whether Tobruk could be held at all after September. On the 23rd, the same day the Chiefs cabled Menzies' request to him, Churchill summoned him to London. Facing a journey on which he would be pressed hard to mount an offensive he did not want to mount, and knowing a full seaborne relief could not be completed before late September, he was in no position to concede one on the eve of departure. He conceded part of it instead. The 18th Brigade could come out, which would allow both the 6th and 7th Australian Divisions to be reconstituted as complete formations, and a wider relief would be studied. There was a formation available to replace it. The Polish Independent Carpathian Brigade had been formed in Syria in April of 1940 by order of the Polish government in exile, built outward from a nucleus of one commander and 32 staff officers, as Polish soldiers escaped from internment and prisoner of war camps and made their way there by every route available. A very high proportion of its recruits had held commissions in the vanquished Polish army and served now as sergeants or in the ranks. The official history's description of them is the warmest sentence in the entire volume, calling them men self-selected by initiative, sifted by adversity, culled of the weak-hearted by the barriers they had surmounted, and motivated by an insatiable hatred of their nation's oppressors. When they reached Tobruk, they were disappointed to learn they would face Italians rather than Germans, and said so openly, without any suggestion of disloyalty. Theirs was a personal war. What neither side in the argument knew was that the attack they were disputing the likelihood of was already being drafted. On the 2nd of July, the German Army Chief of Staff ordered Rommel to submit a plan for the reduction of Tobruk. Rommel submitted it on the 15th, 3 days before Blamey wrote his letter. He proposed concentrating almost all German forces in Africa for the assault, preceded by 10 days of bombing to soften the defences, breaching the perimeter at dawn, with the Matilda tanks captured during battle acts leading the way. At the beginning of August, the German High Command set out its objectives for the rest of the year, and the timetable was explicit. Provided the weather caused no delay and the transports ran as planned, the campaign against Tobruk would begin in the middle of September. Blamey had argued that a serious attack might come within a few months, and the garrison would not be fit to meet it. London had answered that the available information gave no reason to expect one. Both were writing in the same fortnight that Rommel put his assault plan on paper, and neither of them knew it. In the event, Rommel waited 2 months for the forces he had been promised, because the Royal Navy proved a more effective obstacle to reinforcement than any staff timetable had allowed for. Through August, the reassurances flowed back to Canberra, and every one of them was worth less than it sounded. Menzies, who knew nothing of the exchanges going on in Cairo, was disturbed to have received no answer at all to his cable of the 20th of July, and telegraphed again on the 7th of August asking for an early reply. He got one from Viscount Cranbourne, the Secretary of State for Dominion Affairs, answering in Churchill's absence at the Atlantic meeting with Roosevelt. London entirely agreed in principle that the Australian force should be concentrated as soon as possible, Cranbourne wrote, and Auchinleck had undertaken to see to it immediately on his return, anticipating no difficulty except in regard to Tobruk, where he was as anxious as Menzies to relieve the garrison. Blamey, from Cairo, told his Prime Minister that the policy was agreed and the plans prepared. Everyone told Menzies the matter was in hand. Blamey did not believe it. Writing to the Minister for the Army on the 18th of August, he said there had been a great deal of opposition to the relief of the troops in Tobruk, that it certainly presented difficulties, but that all of them could be overcome, and that he was perfectly sure in his own mind that the difficulties were largely due to staff opposition to the Australian desire to concentrate the 3 divisions under a single command. He added that he might have to press further to get the 9th Division out. The first lift went in on the night of the 21st of August and ran until the 29th, under the operational name Treacle. The ships were usually alongside for about an hour and a half, in which roughly 150 tons would be unloaded, 850 men put ashore, and an equal number taken off. Out with the 18th Brigade went the 18th King Edward VII's own cavalry regiment, and they deserve a sentence of their own, because almost nobody has given them one since. Moorshead's official report singled them out. The regiment was untrained for the duties it was handed, took up its allotted position in the front line as infantry practically from the moment the defences were first occupied, and remained there continuously until the night it embarked. And by fighting spirit, venturesomeness, and constant alertness, these stalwart Indians held a very wide front for a very long period, throughout which the enemy was made to feel and to fear their presence. An Indian account of the same departure recorded that they had been treated in every respect as a unit of the Australian force, and that after the relief men of the regiment received letters from the Australians they had served beside, and in some cases from those men's families back in Australia. The soldiers holding the perimeter had known nothing about any of it. The negotiations had been kept from the garrison entirely, and the official history records that not one rumour escaped. What broke the secret was the arrival of the Polish advance parties by destroyer during the night of the 20th of August, and by that evening the news had reached every corner inside the wire. The diarist of the 2nd 13th Field Company wrote that the 18th Brigade Group and certain other units were to be relieved by a Polish brigade, that this was a bolt from the blue, and that rumours were rife. The same man had written a few days earlier, when his company was ordered back into the dangerous western sector with no explanation offered, and no say given to anyone, that the move was immediate, that the men were tired out, and that although they did not like the prospect, they had not murmured. For a week, the Polish parties lived among the Australians from headquarters down to platoon level, going out on patrols with them and learning the routines, and in some cases forming friendships that lasted, the barrier of two languages beaten down by nothing more than the willingness of both sides to get on with it. 18 days before those ships came in, the garrison had made one more attempt on the salient, and it is worth returning to, because it settled in blood what the cables were arguing about on paper. 0 hour was 3:30 in the morning on the 3rd of August, 2 attacks going in simultaneously against the shoulders of the German pocket, supported by more than 60 guns. The ground on one flank had been analysed by a brigade major named Daly with a clarity that reads almost like a warning issued in advance. The objective sat at the top of an escarpment and the Australian positions at the bottom, which allowed the enemy to observe every metre of ground between them from both flanks, with his weapons sighted to produce heavy enfilade machine gun fire, while the narrowness of the front let him cover the whole approach with artillery and mortars. There were no covered lines of approach at all. What that meant in practice was that men would have to cross open ground under observation to reach wire they then had to blow, in front of posts sown with anti-personnel mines. The 2nd 43rd Battalion went at a position called Post R7, with 4 officers and 139 men, and lost 4 officers and 97 of them. 29 were killed. A platoon under Warrant Officer Quinn overshot the post in the dark, swung around and attacked it from the north, and one of its sections was lit up by flares and wiped out entirely by mortar bombs. The rest pressed on through the mines to the edge of an anti-tank ditch nobody had been able to bridge, and Quinn reached it with 7 men beside him. 3 survived. On the other shoulder, a company under Captain Conway went. At posts S6 and S7, with 135 men, including attached engineers, and 83 of them were killed, wounded, or missing. They took S7 and held it through an entire summer day under close-range fire, and at 8:20 that evening Conway sent out a message with 2 signallers. He was in the post with Lieutenant McHenry and 19 other ranks, 9 of them very badly injured. The remainder were too fatigued to offer any resistance. They had about 1,200 rounds left, no bandages at all, and needed morphia. 10 new men, he wrote, could hold the post. He surrendered just before 11 o'clock, when the ammunition was almost gone, and the Germans were in the ditch around him. Next morning, vehicles from both sides drove out into that fire-swept ground, flying the Geneva emblem. The Germans allowed the Australian trucks to approach within 200 yards, cleared their own minefields so the wounded could be reached, brought out 4 wounded men and 15 dead from the post themselves, and gave a sergeant to it a drink. Tuit's party recovered 5 wounded and 28 dead. The same courtesy failed a few hundred metres away, where Staff Sergeant Lyall was granted permission to take a truck under the Red Cross flag to 2 posts holding wounded, and the Germans let the vehicle come on, and then fired on the men as they climbed down from it. What the 3rd of August established was not a matter of morale. In July, Morshead had written to Blamey that his troops were in wonderful heart, and their morale never higher. 2 weeks later, 2 platoon-strength assaults backed by 21 troops of artillery could not take and hold 2 posts. Lance Corporal Anderson, wounded twice, kept his Bren firing on the German Sangers from outside the wire until his own officer went out and dragged him in, and died about 2 hours later. None of these men had any idea that a doctor in Cairo had already set in motion the process that would take their division out of the fortress. They died in the 3rd week of an argument that had 11 weeks left to run. By the time the Polish brigade was settling into the southern sector, the government that had begun the argument no longer existed. Menzies resigned on the 28th of August, and Arthur Fadden, the leader of the Country Party, took office on the 29th with 13 party supporters in a parliament of 75, holding power only through the votes of 2 independents, named Arthur Coles and Alex Wilson. It is worth noticing what did not change with the government. The question went repeatedly before the Inter-Party Advisory War Council, where the leaders of all 3 parliamentary parties sat together at the same table, so that Fadden, Menzies and John Curtin were in the same room as the matter was discussed. Blamey cabled the new Prime Minister on the 4th of September. The garrison had now been besieged 5 months. The troops were in good heart, but the decline in physical condition was definite. Relief was strongly opposed in Cairo. He had been asked to relieve the British artillery in the fortress with the 9th Division's own gunners, and had refused, because in his view that would mean the 9th Division stayed indefinitely. The difficulties were real, but none of them could not be overcome with the will to do so, as was evidenced by the fact that between a quarter and a third of the original garrison had already been taken out without serious interference. If the relief were not insisted on now, and the force were attacked with strength and determination. After another month or 2 of decline, it would not be fit to withstand the attack, and catastrophe was possible. He noted the counter-argument that no such attack was expected, and answered it in a single sentence. The same position, he wrote, had existed in Cyrenaica when the force was transferred to Greece, and the Germans had attacked successfully. London's answer came on the 11th of September, and it came in 2 parts. Cranbourne transmitted Auchinleck's private telegram in its entirety, describing it as the product of prolonged consultation with the naval and air commanders in the Middle East. Alongside it went Churchill's own message. If Australia insisted, only half the garrison could be removed during the moonless period of September, and the other half would have to come out in the second half of October, which was precisely when preparations for the coming offensive would be at their most intense, and when the Air Force would need to concentrate everything on the enemy's rear areas, dumps and airfields. No statement could be made to the Australian Parliament in any case, because any public suggestion that reliefs were taking place might bring heavy air attack onto Tobruk harbour at the very time the troops were withdrawing. If Australia nevertheless insisted, the orders would go out regardless of what they cost and what they ruined. And then came the appeal that has outlived every other line in the correspondence, the one this story opened with, in which a man directing a global war stopped arguing about moonlight and fighter cover altogether, and asked another man to consider what posterity would make of him. Fadden was being asked to accept a decision he could not explain to his parliament, could not announce to his country, and could not defend in public, by a government that had just told him his own request had forced its commander-in-chief to disclose the shape of a coming offensive. He had been in office less than 3 weeks. His reply, sent on the 15th of September, went through Auchinleck's case one objection at a time, and it is the most impressive document any of the participants produced. On the naval risk, the reasons were noted, but in the absence of effective naval opposition in the Mediterranean, or of any contemplated naval operations, this did not appear a sufficiently weighty reason. On air protection, Blamey had already agreed in early August to postpone the relief by a month precisely, so that air strength could be built up, and given the increase since then, and the improved situation in Syria, Iraq, and Iran, the reason no longer appeared adequate. On the constraint of the moonless periods, the reasons were noted, and Fadden conceded that one without argument. On the availability of other troops to do the relieving, he was blunter, writing that frankly the reasons advanced against relief by other Dominion troops were unconvincing. The reference to a sortie from Tobruk, he said, filled his government with grave concern, in view of the advice it had received that the 9th Division would be quite unfitted for an operation involving continuous and severe fighting. On the physical decline, he simply quoted the Commander-in-Chief back at himself, observing that Auchinleck stated the health and morale of the garrison were very good, while its power of endurance was noticeably reduced, and that if it could not be relieved, it would be required to stand up to a total period of 8 to 9 months of continuous frontline service under conditions of great hardship and a trying climate, at the end of which it was to carry out an offensive operation. Then he caught them. The proposal to reinforce the garrison with a battalion of heavy tanks, Fadden wrote, appeared to acknowledge the decreasing power of that garrison, and at the same time to discount the very difficulties of air and naval protection which had previously been urged against a movement of personnel only. It is the sharpest paragraph in the entire correspondence, and it was written by a man who had been Prime Minister for a fortnight against the combined position of the British War Cabinet and 3 service commanders-in-chief. In view of the responsibilities reposed in the commander of the Australian force, and the advice tendered by him, and by the commander of the 9th Division, supported by the government's own advisers, he was bound to request that the withdrawal of the 9th Division and the reconcentration of the Australian Imperial Force be proceeded with. This was not a politician overruling his generals. It was a politician choosing between 2 sets of generals who disagreed, and choosing the ones his own country's law had made responsible to him. Churchill's cable had ended not with a military argument, but with a moral one, and the moral argument was the one Fadden declined. The second lift ran during the moonless period of late September under the name Supercharge, taking the 24th Australian Brigade out and bringing British troops in. The ships were already running while the cables were still being written. Churchill made one more attempt, and it was the hardest thing he had. On the 30th of September, he told Fadden, for his most secret information, that he and Oliver Lyttelton had only with difficulty prevented Auchinleck from resigning his command, on the grounds that the Australian government had no confidence in his military judgment, and that had the Australian decision been based on political grounds rather than military ones, Auchinleck would not have felt the want of confidence that was implied. The claim needs to be handled carefully, because it reaches us only through Churchill, in a message written expressly to change a man's mind, and no independent confirmation of it appears in the available record. The rest of that cable made the appeal plainer still. Everything pointed to the first days of November, and the period during which the remaining Australian brigades would be involved was very short. Australian troops had borne the burden of Tobruk, and all in London would deeply regret that they should be cut out of the honour. Everyone there realised Fadden's political embarrassments with a majority of only one, and nevertheless, Churchill wrote, "Australia might think this a time to do and dare." They had been greatly pained by the suggestion, not made but implied, that an undue burden had been thrown on Australian troops. The debt to them was immense, but the imperial forces had suffered more casualties, both actually and relatively, and the British submarine service had lost nearly a third of its men killed outright. And then, at the end of the same cable, having invoked history, honour, God and the dead of the submarine service, Churchill wrote the sentence that ended the argument. "But please understand," he said, "that at whatever cost your orders about your own troops will be obeyed." 18 months after it was drafted, in a message intended to overturn it, the Charter had been acknowledged in writing by the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. Fadden replied on the 4th of October, and his tone had changed. He assured Churchill that no want of confidence was felt in the military judgment of Auchinleck. He hastened to assure him that neither by suggestion nor by implication had he or his government intended to convey that an undue burden had been thrown on Australian troops, who had been proud to fight side by side with the troops of the motherland and the Empire, and to share equally with them all the disappointments, the perils, the triumphs, and the sacrifices of the campaign in the Middle East. And then, having given every inch of ground that could be given without giving the only one that mattered, he wrote that while his government was prepared, as in the past, to make every sacrifice in common with the rest of the Empire, it could not see its way to depart from its conclusion. The day before that cable was sent, his government had ceased to exist. Coles and Wilson voted against Fadden's budget on the 3rd of October, and on the 7th, John Curtin was sworn in at the head of a Labour government. Fadden had been Prime Minister for 40 days, the shortest tenure of any Australian Prime Minister of the century, apart from caretakers, and he had spent a substantial part of it refusing the British War Cabinet. Churchill turned immediately to the third Prime Minister of the argument. On the 13th of October, he asked Curtin to allow the 2 Australian brigades still inside Tobruk to remain there until the result of the approaching battle was known. Curtin took it to his War Cabinet and replied on the 16th that the request had been carefully considered, and that his government was not disposed to vary the decision of the previous administration. 3 Prime Ministers, drawn from 3 different parties, across 7 weeks that included the collapse of 2 governments, had arrived at precisely the same answer, which meant this had never been the policy of a government at all. It was the position of a country. On the 26th of October, Churchill wrote to Curtin that the relief was being carried out in accordance with his decision, which he greatly regretted. The final lift, Operation Cultivate, had begun on the 12th of October and would take until the 25th. The 20th and 24th Australian Brigades were to come out and British brigades to go in, along with the 11th Czechoslovak Infantry Battalion. Across all 3 operations, some 15,000 men were carried out of Tobruk, and a similar number carried in, over 31 nights of running. On the 22nd of October, Morshead handed the fortress to Major General Ronald Scobie of the British 70th Division, and learned that he had been promoted Lieutenant General. 3 nights later, His Majesty's ship Latona sailed from Alexandria with the destroyers Encounter, Hero and Hotspur. She was an Abdeel-class fast mine-layer, commissioned only in April, one of the newest ships in the Royal Navy, and this was the 10th and final movement of Cultivate and her 13th run to Tobruk. Accounts differ on exactly what she was carrying that night, and the sources cannot be reconciled. What is not in dispute is what she was to carry on the way back. Waiting at the harbour for a night embarkation were the last Australians in the fortress. About 1,000 men, most of them the infantry of the 2nd 13th Battalion. North of Bardia, she was found by aircraft. A bomb from a Junkers 87 struck her in the engine room and started a fire that ran out of control, and Hero and Encounter came alongside to take off most of the troops and the crew before she blew up and sank about 2 hours later when the fire reached a magazine. One account puts her dead at 37 of her own ship's company, and they are the only sailors in this story anyone has bothered to count. By the time the survivors were aboard the destroyers, it was far too late to reach Tobruk in darkness, and the convoy turned back for Alexandria. The 2nd 13th Battalion went back to its positions inside the perimeter. Some of its men said afterwards that they had been done in by their own battalion number. Australia had won the argument. 3 prime ministers, 3 months of cables, a threatened resignation, and an appeal to the judgment of history had all been expended on getting these men out. And on the last night of the last operation, a single aircraft settled the fate of 1,000 of them, in a way that 4 governments had been unable to settle in writing. The British then asked the battalion, less the advance party that had already gone, whether it would stay for the coming breakout. It stayed. In the middle of November, the British launched Operation Crusader. The offensive Auchinleck had insisted on preparing properly, and it dissolved almost at once into a confusing series of tank and infantry actions. As it ground its way westward, the garrison came out to meet it, seizing the high ground at Ed Duda, east of the fortress, and then losing part of it again. Between the 29th of November and the 1st of December, the 2nd 13th took the ridge back in a night attack with the bayonet, after a battalion of the Essex Regiment had been forced off it. 2 companies, 160 men in total, went at a position held by something like 450 Germans, and when the fighting there was over, 167 of them were prisoners. Then the battalion held the ridge under artillery fire heavy enough to leave men who had survived everything else in Tobruk without the words for it. Private Arthur Armstrong wrote that they had been shelled continually for 2 days, that it was terrible, and that he could not describe it. On the 7th of December, Rommel gave up the siege and fell back towards Tripoli. Sources differ over how to date the end of it, since the link-up came in late November and the formal relief in early December, and the durations quoted run from 240 to 242 days. What is not disputed is the distinction the 2nd 13th earned by accident. It was the only Australian unit present for the whole of it. The accounting can be set down precisely because the official historian did it. Between the 8th of April and the 25th of October, the 9th Division lost 749 men killed, 1,996 wounded, and 604 taken prisoner. Counting the division and its attached troops across the whole span from March to December, the totals were 832 killed, 2,177 wounded, and 941 prisoners. The garrison as a whole suffered close to 4,000 casualties, most of them Australian. Axis losses in the attempt to take the place are put at about 12,000. What all of it purchased was time and a threat. While Tobruk held, Rommel could not launch a major attack into Egypt, and the garrison tied down 4 Italian divisions and 3 German battalions, a force twice its own size, at the end of a supply line that could not comfortably feed them. In late January of 1942, Rommel attacked again and took back the ground he had lost. In June, he took Tobruk itself from a South African and British garrison, and Hitler made him a field marshal for it. The fortress that Churchill had told Australia it must stay inside and be honoured forever for holding, fell to somebody else in a day. 8 months. 1 day. none of the men who had held it knew there had ever been an argument. The confidences were kept so completely that for all but one or two of the Australians inside the fortress, the first intimation their departure had been the subject of a dispute between two governments came after the war, with the publication of Churchill's account of it in the Grand Alliance. He wrote there that it gave him pain to relate the incident, that to suppress it indefinitely would have been impossible, and that besides, the Australian people had a right to know what happened and why. The Australian official history's response to that is quieter than the provocation deserves and more damaging for it. For that very reason, it observes, it was unfortunate that in relating the differences between the two governments, Churchill quoted extensively from his own messages to the successive Australian Prime Ministers, and did not disclose the text of their replies. His implication had been that Fadden's government insisted because it had been induced to do so by hard pressure from its political opponents. Privately, he went further, telling the Minister of State in Egypt that he had been astounded at the Australian government's decision, was sure it would be repudiated by Australia if the facts could be made known, and that allowances had to be made for a government with a majority of one facing a bitter opposition, parts of which at least were isolationist in outlook. The record does not support him. No Australian government was moved to its course by its political opponents. The three successive Prime Ministers were the leaders of the three parties in the Commonwealth Parliament, and they were in entire agreement throughout, sitting together on the Advisory War Council to which the question was referred again and again, and in a course pursued without deviation through two changes of government. The political leaders were guided at every step, and in most instances impelled, by the representations of their military advisers, principally Blamey himself. The problem was military in its origin. One historian of Australian command has put the failure plainly, writing that Churchill never fully understood the reason for the demands, that he thought it was Blamey wanting to throw his weight around, and the Australian government's political difficulties, and that he failed to appreciate that the Australians might simply have different priorities from the British. The most useful verdict comes from the friendliest possible witness. Writing in the Journal of the International Churchill Society itself, the historian Raymond Callaghan records that Australia proved the most difficult dominion, that the Australians insisted in the summer of 1941 that their 9th Division was due for relief and carried their point against vehement objections from Churchill, that Churchill was privately furious and gave that anger full expression in his memoirs, and that in this case, as in the argument over Burma the following year, the Australians were right. That precedent outlived the argument that made it. In March of 1942, Churchill wanted 2 Australian divisions. On their way home after 2 years in the Middle East, diverted to Rangoon to hold Burma, and Australia refused, and went on refusing even after he enlisted President Roosevelt to press the case. Later, when British command attempted to distribute the 9th Division's brigades among British divisions, Morshead remembered Blamey's orders on the matter and resisted that too. The division he brought out of Tobruk fought at both battles of El Alamein, and Montgomery said afterwards that he did not know of any other Allied division that could have done what it did there. Morshead went on to the New Guinea and Borneo campaigns and died of cancer in September of 1959. Rommel, recalled to Europe, and by then disillusioned with the regime he served, was implicated in the plot against Hitler and forced to kill himself in October of 1944. What Australia kept in the end was not the memory of the argument, which almost nobody outside the archives has ever heard, but the memory of the ground. Dozens of Australian towns and suburbs carry the name Tobruk on their streets and their parks. A sample of soil from Tobruk lies in the floor of the Hall of Service at the Anzac Memorial in Sydney. Curtin told the Australian Parliament that when the history of the war came to be written, the Epic of Tobruk would certainly be one of its most glorious pages. 4 men and 1 battalion carried the weight of this, and none of them ever met to talk it over. Samuel Burston noticed that a few soldiers on leave in Cairo looked thin, and set two governments against each other for 3 months. Thomas Blamey told a room full of British commanders that Australia was an independent nation, that she had entered the war under certain definite agreements, and that in the name of his government he demanded the relief of these troops. Leslie Morshead told his men there would be no surrender and no retreat, and told his own commander in the same fortnight that their morale had never been higher. Arthur Fadden, 17 days into the job with 13 members behind him, was invited to consider his responsibility before history, and answered by taking a commander-in-chief's argument apart one line at a time. Claude Auchinleck was refusing London and Canberra simultaneously, and was rewarded by being told that one of them had lost confidence in him. And the 2nd 13th Battalion never received the relief its country spent 3 months winning, and went out and took Ed Duda instead. There is no tidy way to close a story like this one, and it would be dishonest to try. The objections raised against letting the Australians go were real. The shipping was dangerous, the moon was wrong, the fighter cover was needed somewhere else, and a fortress halfway through changing hands is a fortress at its most vulnerable. The case for letting them go was also real. The men had been in the line since March, their endurance was measurably reduced, and nobody could say when the next assault would come, least of all the two governments arguing about whether one was likely. Neither side was bluffing, and neither side was simply wrong. What the argument actually settled was not whether Tobruk should be held, because on that point everybody agreed. It settled who decides. And the answer was written down by Churchill himself, at the bottom of the same cable in which he invoked God and history, when he said that at whatever cost, Australia's orders about her own troops would be obeyed. So tell me in the comments, honestly, when your closest ally asks you to leave your own soldiers where they are, and gives you good reasons for it, what does a country owe them, and what does it owe itself? If you want to know what became of the men of the 9th Division after they sailed out of that harbour, and what they did at El Alamein a year later, watch this next.